Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another live stream. It's your host, Dhaiphong, and as you can see, I am joined by two very special guests. I have with me today Lee Camp. He's the host of Dangerous Ideas, journalist, comedian, and so many more things. We also have Ben Norton. He's the editor, curator, and host of Geopolitical Economy Report. Both of those channels can be found in the video description. Welcome, gentlemen, to the show. It's good to see you both again.
What's up? Good to see you.
Thanks for having me, Danny. It's always a pleasure.
Yes. It's been too long. I'm glad to get you both together here because we have a lot to get to, both on the U.S. front, but we all know the U.S. front is very much connected to the global front. One of the things I wanted to start with actually was in the midst of the Netanyahu Congress speech debacle, we also had, of course, a lot of rumors about what was going to happen to Joe Biden. And he gave a speech right after the Congress debacle, right after Netanyahu's speech in Congress, kind of addressing how he's resigned from the campaign for 2024. But he had this very curious thing to say for our purposes, and I just want to play it. He didn't look well, but that's been the case for Biden for quite some time. But here is what he had to say about the U.S.'s role in the world right now.
I will keep working to ensure America remains strong, secure, and the leader of the free world. I'm the first president in this century to report to the American people that the United States is not at war anywhere in the world. We'll keep rallying a coalition of proud nations to stop Putin from taking over Ukraine, doing more damage. We'll keep NATO stronger, and I'll make it more powerful and more united than any time in all of our history. I'll keep doing the same for our allies in the Pacific.
Sorry about that. I just want to say bravo to whoever got that camera angle too. I don't know who.
I was going to say, does he know he's not looking at the camera?
But I just want to, whoever wants to begin, I don't know if either Ben or Lee, you want to begin, because it's very curious given what's happening in Gaza, given what's happening in Ukraine, given what's happening in Yemen, recent bombings, and we can go on and on and on. Maybe Ben, how about you just kick it off with your reaction to Joe Biden's assertion? Trump has made similar assertions during his
here's the problem. You can let Ben go first, but I guarantee you he will cover everything. So there will be nothing left for me on this question.
Go ahead, Lee.
Sure.
You go first.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's absolutely surreal because the sentence immediately after he says that is he boasts about how the U.S. is supporting Ukraine in a war on Russia. So he's like, we're not in a war, but we're winning this war. So it's completely preposterous in every single way. I mean, I'll just go through the list pretty briefly. So the same week he said that, the U.S. was bombing Yemen. The U.S. has been repeatedly bombing Yemen, not just recently. This actually goes back to just after 9/11. So for over 20 years, the U.S. has been endlessly bombing Yemen. Jeremy Scahill famously wrote about that in his book that became the movie Dirty Wars. I mean, this has been going on so long. For most of our lives, the U.S. has been at war in Yemen. Then, of course, the U.S. is still militarily occupying Iraq, and the U.S. is militarily occupying Syria, and the U.S. is, including under Biden, continues to carry out periodic drone strikes in Iraq and in Syria, and the U.S. under Biden has continued drone strikes in Somalia as recently as a few months ago. And furthermore, you mentioned Ukraine, of course. I mean, this is so obvious. The U.S. is not only arming Ukraine with billions of dollars of weapons, but there have been many reports showing that the U.S. has special operations forces on the ground, and there are also special ops forces from the UK, from the Netherlands, from Germany. This has been reported by the New York Times, by the BBC, by many mainstream media outlets. There was a U.S. official, actually, who was imprisoned because he leaked information about this that ended up going in it was like on his like friend chat group that he was boasting that he had all these documents. But the point is that there's so much evidence showing that the U.S. literally has boots on the ground in Ukraine. And there was also a big scandal a few months ago Germany got really mad because the UK revealed that Germany also has forces directly on the ground in Ukraine. So the US is involved there. Furthermore, there's Israel. And not only in the sense that the US has been sending billions of dollars of weapons to Israel to carry out these crimes against humanity. And of course, war criminal Netanyahu just visited Washington, spoke to Congress, got standing ovations while committing these constant massacres. But furthermore, let's not forget, there was this horrific massacre, one of many. I mean, every week there's another. But there was a scandal where Israeli special forces carried out a raid inside Gaza, and they allegedly saved some hostages. And in the process, they killed hundreds of Palestinian civilians. And we now know that the U.S. military, U.S. Special Operations Forces, were also involved in this operation in Gaza. So it's not just that the U.S. is supporting Israel. The U.S. military is directly involved. We saw this nonsensical scandal where the U.S. military spent billions of dollars building this pier, this dock that like blew away in the water. And then they said they were going to build it again. So the U.S. quite literally...
And now they say it's over.
Directly involved. I mean, I could keep going on and on, but this idea that the U.S. is not in any war is completely preposterous on so many grounds. Go ahead, Lee.
Yeah, I told you, you left me scraps. Yeah, no, it's utterly laughable. I mean, as is most of the crap that comes out of his face. But, I'll just say, it's not like a small way that the U.S. is involved in many of these countries. In Syria, we still claim to basically own a third of Syria. And you mentioned some of it with Israel. Like you said, it's not just the weapon shipments, which are roughly every 36 hours, but even the New York Times has admitted that the CIA is advising and giving surveillance to Israel on who to assassinate in Gaza. So the CIA is directing Israel on how to assassinate people in Gaza. You have U.S. and British drones giving surveillance. You have that leaked memo that The Intercept reported on from the Pentagon telling U.S. troops in Iraq to be ready for an invasion of Gaza. It's absolutely boots on the ground as well as the pier, although I guess that didn't count because it was flip-flops in the sand. That's different than boots on the ground. Of course, the U.S. is a U.S.-backed genocide going on right now in Gaza, and yeah, I mean, you covered all the other important things. Obviously, Ukraine being one of the most important, and like you said, he mentions NATO, which is a war-making pact. It is endless war, and to pick up one of the scraps you left me is we also have, of course, the economic wars, which are done on dozens and dozens of countries, and people die. It's economic wars are not like, oh, people don't have as much money. It's like, the UN Rapporteur estimates 100,000 have died in Venezuela from the U.S. economic war on them. So the U.S. economic war on Syria, along with the boots on the ground, it has 94% of the people in Syria under the poverty line. People absolutely are dying from these economic wars as well.
Yeah, quick point. I'm glad you mentioned economic war, Lee. You and I and Danny, we've been talking about this issue for so long, for so many years. I was actually surprised to see that finally the Washington Post just published a big story on U.S. economic war.
Yeah.
And they acknowledged in that report, which is, CIA Times, Jeff Bezos' personal property, they admit that 1/3 of the countries on Earth are under U.S. sanctions, and 60% of poor countries on Earth are under U.S. sanctions. 60% of poor countries. That is incredible. I mean, this is not just economic war against a few countries. We know Venezuela, Syria, Iran, China, Zimbabwe, DPRK, but the majority of poor countries, absolutely amazing. This is how much the U.S. is at war with the entire world. And then Biden says we're not at war. I mean, it truly is dystopian.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things that's going on right now, especially in the last several weeks, there's been a lot of chaos on the U.S. political scene. Of course, what's going on in Gaza and Ukraine and all these wars that you mentioned, Ben and Lee, they've blown back pretty hard on the Biden administration. They become pretty deep electoral issues. Then you have Kamala Harris coming into the scene as kind of like, oh, baby blue, like no one knows who she is anymore. She comes in, and then immediately, as Netanyahu is giving this speech, she doesn't go, And a lot of Democrats said they didn't go to Netanyahu's speech. A lot of them didn't really say why. Nancy Pelosi gave some mealy-mouthed statement, but Kamala Harris then comes out the next day and says these pro-Hamas protesters, they are anti-Semitic. This is the same. I mean, talk about it, maybe Lee, you can jump in here. Like Kamala Harris as a warmonger to be. She's been vice president. She's served with Biden. Now she's being talked about as kind of similar to how Biden talked about wars. U.S. isn't in any wars. Kamala Harris she has no record at all. Could you talk about Kamala Harris?
Yeah, no record at all, right? Well, first, just let me start with the fact this is the third presidential election in a row that the Democratic Party has put in a presidential nominee that the people had little to no say over. I mean, they rigged 2016 in about dozens of different ways. They rigged 2020 by getting everyone except Elizabeth Warren to drop out and endorse Joe Biden against Bernie Sanders. And then they come in here and say, within 3 days or 2 days of when Biden says he's not going to run, they've announced that Kamala Harris has basically sealed up the nomination, and the entire machine and entire millions of dollars is all going to her. It's so laughable, the idea that there's any kind of democracy going on here. But in terms of Kamala Harris's record, I mean, yeah, she doesn't make the decisions of the presidency, but she has not spoken out against anything that the Biden administration has done in these endless wars. She is a longtime supporter, quote unquote, of Israel, of the, and as the resident Jew here, I can say this stuff, but the Zionist regime of the apartheid regime of Israel. And she has received millions of dollars from AIPAC. She was proudly California's top cop. Putting more people in prison, fighting their ability to get out of prison when they were trying to release people who were nonviolent. She is just gruesome on policing, protecting police, wanting to lock up parents because their children are truant. Like a child doesn't show up to school usually because the mother is, working 2 or 3 jobs or something, and the kid is then not looked after well enough, and she wants the parents put in jail. I mean, just gruesome stuff. She was supposedly in charge of some of the immigration policies of this administration, and currently the Biden administration is deporting more people than even Donald Trump did. It just goes on and on. I mean, there's nothing left-wing about the Biden administration, about Kamala Harris. And yeah, she hasn't spoken out against any of these wars. If she does, and when she does speak about them, it's all in support.
Yeah, and there's also the fact that, in addition to the fact that when she does take a foreign policy position, it's always in support of war or warmongering. But in addition to that, she simply knows nothing about foreign policy. We know this because, I mean, her background is obviously in domestic politics, locking up, poor people, as Lee said, pushing to lock up parents of children who don't go to school, who are truant. I mean, insane, extreme, mass incarceration policies. But in addition to that, with the fact that she has no experience, as vice president, Biden has sometimes given her some missions to accomplish that he knew would be unpopular. So, for instance, she oversaw a lot of immigration policy. And as Lee mentioned, Biden has been just as brutal against immigrants as Trump. And let's not forget that when Kamala Harris, she went to Central America, she famously gave a speech and she said, "Do not come, do not come." So the fact is, it's very clear that she's not going to push back in any way against the so-called foreign policy blob in Washington. She knows nothing about it. We saw another example of this when she went to Vietnam in 2021, right after coming in. And the Biden sent her, he clearly didn't care. And what did she do? She went to Vietnam, and then she visited a so-called John McCain memorial, which is not a John McCain memorial. Yes. That was the way it was reported. They do not have a John McCain memorial in Vietnam. They do not. But it was the site where John McCain, this war criminal, was shot down when he was bombing Vietnamese light bulb factories, because, he's portrayed as this war hero. In reality, he was bombing civilian targets, including a light bulb factory, when his plane was shot down in an act of self-defense by the people of Vietnam. So Kamala Harris, who's in Vietnam, hilariously trying to recruit Vietnam for the new Cold War on China, which Vietnam is never going to go along with. They obviously have a non-aligned policy. And while she's there, she slaps her Vietnamese host in the face geopolitically by honoring a right-wing war criminal who was bombing civilian targets in Vietnam. I mean, and then she tweeted about how when she was visiting Vietnam, she was honoring McCain, who was a great hero. This is basic diplomacy. I mean, it's so clear that if Kamala Harris becomes president, her foreign policy is going to be completely outsourced to the same people running Biden's foreign policy. So yeah, Biden is functionally brain dead. So his foreign policy is not being overseen personally by him, it's being done by hawks like, for instance, his Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, a complete neocon, or Jake Sullivan, who's also neocon, his national security advisor. But if Kamala comes in, I mean, it's basically going to be the same thing. She's not functionally brain dead, maybe figuratively brain dead, but her foreign policy is going to be done by the same exact hawks.
Yeah, maybe briefly before we move on, there's been a lot of, now that the election season is going to be a competition between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. We saw Donald Trump even just recently say something to the effect of, well, we should wipe Iran off of the map. We know that his running mate, J.D. Vance, is very much an Iran hawk. And we also know that the same people advising Biden right now have also been kind of sounding the alarm about Iran lately, especially in the wake of all this activity with Yemen. There's been talks about Iran's nuclear capabilities again. There's kind of a rehash. And then Netanyahu comes into Congress in literally without any pushback from the Democrats. And I'll just play this quickly, because he literally calls for a Middle East NATO. I'm gonna pull this up. It's absolutely just no push. I mean, he got applause from Congress, but this is what he had to say in relation to a Middle East NATO.
America forged a security alliance in Europe to counter the growing Soviet threat. Likewise, America and Israel today can forge a security alliance in the Middle East to counter the growing Iranian threat. All countries that are at peace with Israel and all those countries who will make peace with Israel should be invited to join this alliance. We saw a glimpse of that potential alliance on April 14th. Led by the United States, more than half a dozen nations worked alongside Israel to help neutralize hundreds of missiles and drones launched by Iran against us.
Which is an incredible claim to make. We'll just end there, since Iran literally told the United States that it was going to be firing off that operation before it happened in order to, ensure that no conflict was to break out.
Well, and of course, he leaves out why that was done.
Yes, yeah, that too. But whoever wants to jump in, just to react.
How amazing is it? How much of a backwards Orwellian shit show is this to have the guy who is currently committing genocide, who has currently killed 40,000 by direct bombs, but 200,000 if you count famine and disease. That guy standing on stage saying, we need to stop the threat of Iran. Who's the threatening person? The one committing genocide, or the one who, responded by firing at Israel after their generals were assassinated via, with bombs against their consulate, which is supposed to be against international law, after the U.S. assassinated their top general with drone bombs in Iraq. It's so laughable to have the current genocidal maniac saying we need a pact to stop the threat of Iran.
Yeah, I mean, Lee hit the nail on the head. Let's not forget what the order of events were, because, what we've seen is an attempt by the media to erase this history and put something that happened after as if it were before. So what happened is that Israel intentionally launched an attack on Iran's consulate in Syria, killing multiple Iranian officials. Now, this is a blatant violation of international law, which says very clearly that a consulate or an embassy is, which is functionally the same thing, is the sovereign territory of a country. So, for instance, when the UK arrested Julian Assange, British authorities invaded the Ecuadorian embassy, which is Ecuadorian sovereign territory. Now, at that time, the Ecuadorian government was a puppet regime. But the point is this is clearly a violation of the country's sovereignty. This is what Israel did. So they launched an attack on Iranian soil, which is what the consulate was. They killed top Iranian officials. And then Iran said, we are going to respond proportionately. And in the lead up to Iran's attack, there were many reports in mainstream newspapers, like the New York Times had a big story, saying the US government knows that Iran is going to plan on launching this retaliatory attack. Iran advises multiple countries that it's going to carry out this attack. And then not only does the US help Israel, but even Jordan, an important detail here. The monarchy of Jordan intervenes to defend Israel. So this, was a huge, in the region, this was a huge geopolitical development because now everyone can see how completely fake the Jordanian regime's claim is to support Palestinians. Quite literally, the Jordanian military went out of its way to protect Israel against Iran. So, and then of course, after this attack happened, the media portrayed it as if Iran was an aggressive power just trying to start a war with Israel. But when Netanyahu talks about a NATO in the region, what he really means is Israel, which is a big unsinkable aircraft carrier for the US. Netanyahu himself is an American. Let's not forget this. It's often not mentioned. Netanyahu grew up in the US. He went to high school in Philadelphia. He went to college at MIT. His first job was at Boston Consulting Group, working with Mitt Romney. He had US citizenship 2 times. He gave it up the first time to serve in the Israeli military. Then he got his citizenship again to work in the US. Then he gave up his citizenship again to work at the Israeli embassy in Washington. He is an American. And Netanyahu is saying, look, we as the 51st US state in one of the most geostrategic regions of the world, we should form a NATO with the US, its Israeli outpost, the Jordanian monarchy. Maybe who knows who else will join. At this point, what's so funny is that even a lot of the Gulf monarchies, which were historically basically US client states, even they are now trying to maintain a more non-aligned foreign policy, hedging their bets, trying to play Russia and China against the West to do what's in their own interest. So I don't even know at this point who would want to join a West Asian NATO. It would be just the US and Israel and Jordan.
And you guys don't have to join me on this, but let's not forget, I'd say highly likely that Israel then assassinated their president. So there's also that development a month after the strikes on the Iron Dome. So yeah, and Israel has bragged, of course, about assassinating Iranian scientists for years, nuclear scientists for years. So Israel has been the one that has been assassinating Iranian officials over and over and over again. And then they say, we're under threat from Iran.
Yeah. And, it's just so interesting. Netanyahu bringing up, he calls it the Abraham Alliance to kind of stick it in the face of all critics of Israel and Zionism, basically, not only to hype up this Abraham Accords, which were essentially killed by Palestine, by the Palestinian resistance on October 7th. But as you said, there's no one who's going to really join this at this point in the conflict, not least because it's not only Iran's Operation True Promise, which was incredible in and of itself, but you also have developments like Yemen being able to hit Tel Aviv. You have Hezbollah taking incredible intelligence from Israel, and just showing it off. And, there's this reality that when Netanyahu was there, he was in Congress. He was almost like begging the United States to go further down the road to war with Iran. I think that's really what he was as. He was like, please,
And he's
please
been- and he's
go to
been-
war with Iran for us, because
yeah.
the situation Israel is in, he was looking all confident, beating his chest, but I don't think there's much to be confident about. But I'll let whoever wants to jump in.
Well, and he's been begging the UN for war with Iran too, and giving all those speeches where you could hold up the photo of the Wile E. Coyote bomb and say that Iran was almost almost had it or whatever, like just garbage. But yeah, Israel needs the U.S. in order to. I mean, Netanyahu needs more wars and larger wars in order to even stay in office. I think everyone agrees on that. So he has this personal stake in broadening this war. But then on top of that, Israel has to get the U.S. involved in order to even have a chance against Hezbollah and Iran. He needs it to be a full-fledged U.S. war.
Yeah, I mean, what's going on with Israel's constant attacks against Lebanon is really important. And the war, the genocide that Israel's carrying on in Gaza is not getting enough attention in the media anyway, except for maybe like Al Jazeera. But it's largely, at this point, the corporate media in the West has moved on to other issues like Kamala Harris or whatever. But the reality is that what gets even less attention than that is Israel's constant attacks on Lebanon. And we're not just talking about attacks in southern Lebanon, but also attacks in Beirut, in the capital. There have been numerous Israeli attacks deep in Lebanese territory. And I think what this shows is that the Lebanese resistance has a lot of restraint and is very strategic. Because from the very beginning of this genocide, going back to October, there were a lot of people at first who were criticizing Hezbollah and other resistance groups, saying that they should open up another front of the war and stop Israel and the genocide. But in reality, what the Lebanese resistance and also Iran and the Iraqi resistance and the Syrian resistance, what these resistance forces have shown is that being very patient is one of the most important elements of strategy, because Israel is obviously trying to provoke more and more conflict to expand the war, to try to win international support. And they could be falling in Israel's trap. Israel clearly wants a full-on war with Lebanon. They also think that this would mean that the U.S. military would directly intervene as well, at least even more directly. So by keeping this war at a below boiling point, the Lebanese resistance is giving Israel a bloody nose, but also not falling in Israel's trap. So they're maintaining this deterrence. And that's actually probably the best position to be in, because it also divides the Israeli forces so the Palestinian resistance can defend its people against this genocide. But at the same time, it prevents Israel from trying to reshape this narrative. Because now, to the extent there is international tension, it's not enough, but everyone around the world can see this is blatantly a genocide. I mean, there's just a massacre every week. Israeli snipers are shooting Palestinian children multiple times in the head. There was a doctor, an American doctor, who went to Gaza. He's also of Jewish descent. I mean, it's not really that relevant, but because people say that if you support Palestinians, you're anti-Semitic, all this nonsense. Well, this American doctor went to Gaza and he did an interview, and he said that he found these children that he operated on who were shot 2 times in the head. That's not an accident. That's obviously intentional. They were shot 2 times right near the heart. That's not an accident. These Israeli snipers are intentionally killing Palestinian children, just as they did in 2018 and 2019. Another event that has been erased from history, it's not even that long ago, which was the Great March of Return. You hear all of these Israeli propagandists saying, when are the Palestinians going to peacefully protest? They did for many, many months. Of course, they've done it for many decades, but in the Great March of Return from 2018 to 2019, every single week they had this huge march up to the Gaza concentration camp fence, and Israeli snipers would play games, and for fun, they would try to shoot as many kneecaps and what other body parts of Palestinian civilians. They killed dozens of Palestinian doctors and nurses and medics. They killed many Palestinian journalists. They handicapped entire families. This has all been erased. So we know that the Israeli military has done this for a long time. So the point is that the entire world's attention is on this. Outside of the US, which is a bubble, everyone in maybe a few countries in Europe, everyone else in the world can see this is a blatant genocide. But if the war expands into an open regional war, then Israel can try to change the narrative and say, we are fighting for our existence and we're a democracy, blah, blah, all this nonsense, which obviously it's not a democracy. But by the strategic patience of these resistance forces, I think is something that is quite remarkable. And I think that's something that's not commented on a lot because, we talked about Iran, the constant assassination of Iranian officials, the constant Israeli attacks. And people say, why doesn't Iran defend itself? Well, Iran does defend itself, but it's very strategic and very patient. And it can be difficult to be patient, but if your enemy is committing all of these errors and hanging themselves, as Lenin, it's probably an apocryphal quote, but Lenin famously said, the capitalists will sell us the noose we used to hang them. Well, Israel is hanging itself geopolitically on the international stage. And that strategic patience, I think, is really something that is not commented on a lot.
Yeah, and just to talk about the patience of Iran real quick, the 300 projectiles of various kinds that they sent at Israel, people may go, well, that wasn't very patient. That was, sending everything at them. But if you actually look what was sent, 86% of them got stopped, but those were all these cheap drones that were slow moving and easy to knock down. And then the 14% or whatever that got through were the hypersonic missiles that were carefully targeted and shot through to prove, hey, even with 4 nations trying to knock these down, the ones we want to get through will get through.
Yeah, and that there's a lot more to it. I remember hearing analysts talk about the potential if Iran really wanted to conduct a true military operation, it would conduct it at a greater scale and show this kind of progression of its prowess in order to essentially overwhelm that so-called or superior Iron Dome of Israel. But I wanted to ask you too.
Well, Danny, a quick point on this as well. Lee made a great point about how Iran intentionally used very old ammunition that it wanted to get rid of anyway, and old drones and stuff. It was just sitting there, dusty. But another thing that Iran got from this is that Iran got information about Israel's anti-missile defense system, because of course the Iranian military is very sophisticated and was very carefully monitoring where that Iranian technology, the drones and missiles, were shot down. And now Iran has more information if it really does want to launch a full-on attack on Israel.
And I wanted to just, to maybe close on this particular geopolitical ground. I mean, of course, we can't disconnect it from anything. But the fact you talked about strategic patience, Ben, I often think what doesn't also get talked about when we talk about the patience of Iran or how the axis of resistance kind of organizes its actual resistance is, Israel does have nuclear weapons. And I always say this to the audience. I say, there's only one, there's, if you count Israel, there's 2, but there's really only one power that's used nuclear weapons in the world. It's the United States, but there's only 2 now that have shown themselves to be so unhinged that they would actually do it if they felt they were cornered enough. And so I can only imagine a scenario, the axis of resistance going full force would likely wipe out the Iron Dome, would likely just absolutely obliterate the IDF. But then what would Israel do? It would say, hey, we got this 200 plus, warheads here. We can use them. And that often doesn't, maybe final comment on that Israel does have nuclear weapons. And I do think that there's not a lot of trust when it comes to Iran and the rest of the axis of resistance on Israel's behavior when it comes to how it navigates and manages its own belligerence.
Yeah, I mean, you've got an unhinged native settler colonial apartheid state that has nuclear weapons. And, let's just, for those who don't know, nuclear weapons are carefully monitored around the world except Israel. Israel is like the one country where they can just, pretend tacitly that they don't have them. And other than a few admissions by various officials so that we know they have them, none of them are like monitored or investigated. It's the complete opposite of what's expected from other countries. And so it's just, it's insane that you have this unhinged country with nuclear weapons that is completely outside of accountability.
Yeah, and of course, Israel has always maintained this position of strategic ambiguity on its nuclear weapons. Everyone knows that it has them, probably around 200, but it's an open secret. It's not officially something that's been admitted by Israel. But in the past few months, the far-right Israeli minister, Amichai Eliyahu, has said that Israel is considering using nuclear weapons. So the fact that he made that public statement 2 times, by the way, is a clear admission by a top Israeli official that they have nuclear weapons, because you cannot consider using nuclear weapons if you don't have them. And this is really important because, and by the way, this guy, Amichai Eliyahu, he's from a neo-fascist party. I mean, a literal fascist. It's a Kahanist party following Meir Kahana, who, by the way, speaking of Israeli fascism, he was from Brooklyn. I mean, Israeli fascism is made in the USA. But on this issue of nuclear weapons, we should also never forget that the Israeli regime offered to give nuclear weapons to the apartheid regime in South Africa. There's this, at this point, it's just like such low-hanging fruit, these Zionists who claim that Israel is not an apartheid regime. I mean, this is so uncontroversial. I remember like 20 years ago, people would get attacked a lot for saying that it was an apartheid regime. But a few years ago, Amnesty International said, yeah, Israel's an apartheid regime. Human Rights Watch said, yeah, Israel's an apartheid regime. Numerous UN bodies have said Israel's an apartheid regime. It's so uncontroversial at this point. But there's also the historical fact that we know, The Guardian reported on this, that in the 70s, the Israeli apartheid regime made a secret deal with apartheid South Africa in order to offer them nuclear weapons. And Israel and apartheid South Africa were very close allies. This is not just like they had a few, interchanges. They were like best friends. And it makes perfect sense because Rhodesia, which was in modern day Zimbabwe, the white supremacist settler state in southern Africa, and then South Africa itself, the apartheid regime, those are basically the same thing as the Israeli regime, except they were not explicitly religious. Israel does have this kind of religious identity, but it's a white settler state founded by European settlers, just in the same way that apartheid South Africa and Rhodesia were founded. And the fact that Israel was willing to give those apartheid regimes nuclear weapons and was so closely allied with them, I mean, this is very important history that we shouldn't forget.
No, and maybe we can take our attention now to how the multipolar world has been navigating this crisis in Gaza, the genocide in Gaza, also the growing lurch, or maybe just the already arrived endless war in West Asia. You have, on the one hand, you have China with this pretty incredible declaration that was signed in Beijing by 14 Palestinian organizations, Palestinian leadership organizations, resistance organizations, from Hamas, Fatah to the rest of the resistance. You also have, you've had Russia meet with the same groups. I think there was some coordination going on between Russia and China over the last several months to the last year. Several meetings between them of Palestinian groups. And then you also have Russia and Iran signing a strategic partnership. Rumors by U.S. intelligence very scared of it, that somewhere in that strategic partnership there's going to be arms to Yemen. And then you also have now Russia meeting with Bashar al-Assad of Syria as they begin to move toward Turkey, Syria, potential peace talks. And of course, this comes on the heels of what I don't think I've spoken to either of you about on this channel, which is Saudi Arabia and Iran normalizing prior to all of these developments. So, there's quite the stark contrast here. How have you all been following these developments and understanding them?
Well, I think one of the most blatant things to notice is that China seems to be involved in creating peace pacts, while the U.S. is involved in obliterating people and sending weapons to drop on children. It's just such a glaring difference. Even when it doesn't succeed, like it hasn't succeeded with Ukraine yet, but due to the U.S., etc. But it's still an effort to create peace in the proxy war in Ukraine. And so it's just such a glaring difference between the United States and China. China wants to use diplomacy. China creates business deals, and the U.S. basically just looks for ways to bend countries to its will, sometimes through straight-on assassination, sometimes through other coups, sometimes through lawfare coups, like in Pakistan, various ways. And then there's the economic wars. But the U.S. is just trying to bend every country to its will, while China facilitates peace and diplomacy for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, you both raised such important points. And Danny, you mentioned this increasing cooperation and partnership between China, Iran, and Russia. This is so important. And I should say that this is the ultimate historical irony, because the U.S. imperial strategist Zbigniew Brzezinski famously wrote in 1997 in his book, The Grand Chessboard, that the biggest threat to U.S. hegemony, U.S. unipolar dominance of the world, would be what he referred to as an anti-hegemonic alliance between, drumroll, China, Russia, and Iran, which is exactly what is happening. And as he pointed out in his book, which he wrote nearly 30 years ago now, he said that this anti-hegemonic coalition would not be based necessarily on, the same system or even necessarily the same ideology, but rather shared grievances. And that's exactly what we're seeing. Obviously, China and Russia have very different systems today, but they're very close partners. And certainly Iran has a very different system. Although I would point out that there are some similarities, especially economically. All three powers have maintained significant public ownership of their strategic national assets, including the banking system, including their natural resources. Let's not forget in Russia that although it is capitalist, it's no longer the Soviet Union, Russia does have a very resource nationalist economy, especially in recent years under Putin. There's been renationalization of the major natural resources. The largest company in the entire Russian economy is Gazprom, which is the state-owned gas giant. The biggest banks in Russia are state-owned, like Sberbank. And in Iran, this is also not talked about. Iran maintains a lot of state ownership, obviously, of the oil sector.
Oh, I think we lost Ben.
It might be a dramatic pause.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, you froze a bit.
Anyway,
you're back.
It looks like... Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Ben.
Hear you. You're frozen, though.
Your picture is frozen.
I lost them.
No, there he is.
Wait, coming back. This is U.S. economic war on Nicaragua.
Right, yeah.
What's going on?
Hey, sorry. Did you lose me? Can you guys hear me?
I can hear you.
Every time he says that, he freezes again.
Lee, if you want to pick it up, well, Ben...
Well, I can't possibly pick up on Ben's thoughts. They're too awesome. So, but no, we can talk about BRICS some if you'd like. It's such an important alliance, and of course, China and Iran and Russia are the linchpin to it, with Brazil coming in fourth, I guess. But yeah, it's incredibly powerful, and a lot of what we're seeing around the world is the U.S. fear of losing hegemony, but that also means fear of de-dollarization. The two go hand in hand, and we're just seeing so many countries that before didn't have the power or the will to stand up against the United States and Western empire, Western hegemony, are now doing it in so many ways. Right. Things like not signing on to the sanctions in the Ukraine proxy war, various African nations throwing out their colonial, leaders, or not leaders, but rulers, owners. I don't know what to call them, but and just so many countries are able to now stand up to the U.S. in a new, stronger way.
I think Ben, good now?
Yeah, sorry, I lost
That's
you guys for a second. So I was saying, just to finish that train of thought, that, you know, what does, it's not just shared grievances, which is obviously U.S. imperialism, U.S. aggression and war. It's not just that brings together countries like China, Russia, and Iran. I mentioned, for instance, you know, it's well known that in 1953, the CIA backed a coup that overthrew Iran's democratically elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, because he nationalized the oil. And the US and also British intelligence wanted that oil to be privatized again by the Shah, the monarchy they reinstalled. But what's not often mentioned is that after the Iranian Revolution in 1979, they once again nationalized the oil. And today, Iran's oil is owned and produced by a state-owned company. So there are some commonalities aside from the ideological differences. But the point I want to get back to is that this issue of Eurasian integration, which was Brzezinski's worst nightmare. I mean, this is so important because we also see that these countries are not only pursuing independent paths of development, but they are not actually pushing for war. I mean, there's either like this ultra leftist talking point or like this liberal talking point. They say, well, like, what about Iranian imperialism or Russian imperialism, which is complete nonsense. They have no idea what imperialism actually is. Imperialism is centered on Wall Street. The United States is the leader of imperialism. It's a country having a foreign policy is not imperialism. Iran has provided support to countries in the region and peoples like the Palestinians who are defending their sovereignty against US-led imperialism. And the reality is that China maintained a very non-aligned policy for many decades because Deng Xiaoping had made this assessment, which ended up being, once again, an example of the strategic patience, which ended up being proven correct. He said, we must bide our time, said, lie low and bide your time, maintain a low profile, because China was in a catch-up stage of economic development, and he knew, and other leaders of the Communist Party of China knew, that if they poked the bear and provoked even more, of a response from the imperial powers, they were so weak that they could not defend themselves. China can now defend itself, and China is now playing a more activist role in its foreign policy. China never had a pro-imperialist foreign policy, but it did have a kind of non-aligned, non-interventionist foreign policy. And it's still non-interventionist in the way that it doesn't, invade countries or impose measures on them. But what China is now doing is stepping up and filling a void in support of international diplomacy and peace. Now, Russia has been doing that for many years, and that goes back to the Soviet Union. But this is actually a pretty new development in China. People have talked about it a lot in Beijing. And what we see now, as you mentioned, Danny, this historic rapprochement in 2023 between Iran and Saudi Arabia. This is absolutely historic in so many ways. First of all, it helps to stabilize the region because the US was trying to use Saudi Arabia to wage proxy war on Iran. The war in Yemen, which was ostensibly led by Saudi Arabia, but in reality, it was the US behind it. That was part of an attempt to try to isolate Iran by weakening some of its allies in the region. And in the process, hundreds of thousands of Yemenis were killed. This brutal war. Another important aspect of this, in addition to stabilizing the region, is, of course, Iran and Saudi are seeking alternatives to the US dollar. So this is a way that China as well is seeking more energy security. And it knows that if there's another kind of conflict, that the US could try to cut Chinese banks out of the SWIFT system, which would make it hard to process transactions involving the dollar, which would make it very difficult for China, being the world's largest importer of oil and gas, to purchase oil and gas in dollars. It would be very difficult. So China's been trying to find ways to purchase oil and gas from the Gulf. It's the largest customer now, the largest trading partner of the Gulf, not the US, which hasn't been for 10 years after the shale revolution in the US oil industry. So China is de-dollarizing its purchases of oil and gas. And now Iran and Saudi are at least invited to join BRICS. Iran has confirmed its offer. Saudi actually is once again kind of playing both sides and being very, ambiguous. They said that they were going to join, and then they actually said in February that they haven't joined and they're still considering it. But the point is that China opened up all of these new political, diplomatic, and economic possibilities through that normalization process. And it also made it clear to the forces in the region that although the resistance forces still, they're very suspicious of Saudi Arabia, rightfully, given its historical role, they can focus on the primary contradiction, which is the US and Israel. They don't have to focus as much on the secondary contradiction of what Ghassan Kanafani, the Palestinian revolutionary, famously referred to as the reactionary Arab regimes. His whole argument was that, you know, it's not just the Israeli regime, but also Saudi, the UAE, you know, Qatar, Jordan. But now what we see is that, at least in the short term, these other countries are, because they're trying to hedge their bets and maintain a non-aligned foreign policy, they would clearly kind of go along with whatever side is best for them. Now the resistance forces don't have to divide their energy, and they can focus on Israel, which is what they're doing. So, you know, there are these ultra leftists who criticize China and say, why isn't China just like sending a bunch of weapons to Palestine, blah, blah, blah. China is playing a particular political role that complements the role of the resistance. The resistance doesn't necessarily need more military support. They have a lot. Hezbollah is the most powerful military in the region. It's more powerful than the IDF. They don't necessarily need more technology and weapons. Well, of course, there's the Iranian military is the most powerful, but I mean, like in the Levant region, around, you know,
and furthermore, as you said earlier, China's basically letting the U.S. and Israel, I mean, especially Israel, kind of hang itself with its own actions. So if China were to get front lines involved, all of a sudden it's a much larger war, which becomes far worse and far more unpredictable. But instead, you can just sit back and watch Israel destroy their reputation around the world.
Yeah, and I'll just add a quick note here. I mean, there's this kind of talking point that it is a bit Orientalist. So people say, you know, China, they have 5,000 years of history, so they don't think in the short term. They think because, I mean, that's obviously kind of exaggerated.
But I don't think all of them are that old, though. 5,000 years.
Exactly. It's obviously kind of Orientalist. But what I will say is that from my experience in different Chinese universities, speaking with people in Chinese think tanks, participating in conferences, Chinese policymakers, they really do think in the medium to the long term. And that's not because they have 5,000 years of history. It's because the Chinese political system is very different. They don't have to focus on these very short-term policies for 2 and 4 year election cycles. The Communist Party can actually make 5-year plans and long-term, it can use long-term strategic thinking and planning. And that's what Belt and Road is. I mean, they're literally thinking 20, 30, 50 years in the future. Whereas in the US, everything is about this, you know, 4-year campaign cycle. If you can raise money, how many votes you can get, depending on whatever this is. So their system is very different. It actually allows them to be much more strategic.
It's partially the campaign cycle, but it's also because the U.S. is a completely unfettered capitalist system. So everything's like fiscal quarter. I mean, it's basically how can we enrich ourselves in the next 6 months? At max, they might plan a year ahead on how weapons contractors can make the most money. There's no planning in the U.S. that ever goes 10 years ahead.
Yeah, and I think just to maybe close on this, it also impacts foreign policy or, you know, imperial policy, because you have the United States as an empire wanting as badly as possible to either expand or maintain its control and dominance over particular regions like West Asia. So we'll do things like very hastily just arm to the teeth Israel, and Israel does whatever it wants. And, you know, now you have the United States in this very precarious position of, well, no one in the world likes what Israel is doing, but the United States needs Israel to continue to exist in its current formation. But then you have Russia and China. A lot of people, you mentioned, Ben, criticisms, right? A lot of people criticize Russia and China, especially over this very question, over how it's handled its relations with Israel. But I don't think what people understand is that when, especially China, but Russia too, when they engage in these kind of diplomatic maneuvers as they balance the situation, they're not just thinking about, well, what's happening today, as much as it might be important. We all want what's happening in Gaza to stop, but at the same time, I think, you know, both of you have intimated that neither are interventionist, and interventionism might actually worsen the situation. If the axis of resistance is saying interventionism is going to worsen the situation in the region, then I think Russia and China are probably going to listen to them, not necessarily to people who, in the United States, we have a warmongering empire that just slaughters people in a very rapid manner. Yeah, we want that to stop. But Russia and China are looking at, well, how do we long-term build the bridges, the roads, politically and economically, to ensure that we can actually get there without ending up in some kind of nuclear catastrophe, which is the position that both Russia and China find themselves in, where they have to think about that quite often and quite frequently.
Yeah, I want to make a quick point that's related to that, what you just said, Danny, which is, if you look at a map of the countries that recognize Hamas as a terrorist organization, it is also the same map of the countries that it put sanctions on Russia, it's the West and a few of its proxies. I mean, it's a tiny fraction of the world population. And Hamas, as a political movement and the governing party in Gaza, has political offices, which are basically kind of function as embassies in multiple countries, including in Russia, by the way. And Hamas just participated in these diplomatic negotiations in Beijing. And they participated along with other Palestinian factions like Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, etc., which are recognized as so-called terrorist organizations as well by a small handful of Western countries. The vast majority of countries on earth do not recognize them as terrorist organizations. And there are numerous UN General Assembly resolutions, including 3535, which said very clearly, which reaffirmed that the Palestinian people have a right to armed resistance. And even recently, as recent as this July, when the International Court of Justice made this historic ruling saying that Israel's occupation not only of the West Bank but also of Gaza is illegal, one of the judges, in his opinions, the opinion that he wrote in this ruling, he also emphasized that as people under occupation, the Palestinians have a right to armed resistance. He pointed out that would be within international law, right? So he would say, hostages are not included in that, but attacking Israeli forces that are occupying them, that is absolutely in the right of Palestinian forces under international law. And Russia and China have recognized that. In fact, China's legal representative said the same exact thing in the ICJ proceedings. He pointed out that under international law, the Palestinians have a right to armed resistance. So we should not forget that Russia and China, when they're engaging in diplomacy with these factions in the region, not only in Palestine, but also Hezbollah, other forces in Iraq, Ansar Allah in Yemen, their relations are political relations, diplomatic relations, as if they were kind of state-to-state relations. So they're dealing at a level of actual diplomacy, like they would be negotiating with the state of Qatar or the state of Saudi Arabia. They kind of deal with these armed groups in the region. So they're dealing on a fundamentally different level. And ultimately, China and Russia want to stabilize the region. They do not want war to continue. And you're absolutely right that if they were to get more directly involved in any way, it would probably be World War III. Like, no one wants World War III. Maybe like a few crazy war hawks in Washington and Tel Aviv. But outside of them, I mean, people asking for like Russia and China to somehow get more directly involved, it's just utopian thinking. These people don't know anything about how diplomacy, geopolitics, military strategy works. And they're asking for the world to be pushed into World War III, which is actually what China and Russia are doing the most as the actual adults in the room to prevent. I mean, the US is so irresponsible in so many ways. And if China and Russia weren't pushing back and trying to put the brake on, we probably would already be in World War III, given how crazily hawkish everyone is in Washington. I mean, it's not just the Biden administration. It's almost all of the Republicans. It's Trump. It's most of the Democratic Party, almost all of the Democrats. I mean, 95% of people in Washington are basically pushing the world toward World War III. And China and Russia are doing everything they can to try to put the brake on.
So, Lee, Ben, do you have a little bit more time? I think Lee needs to go, but I want to kick it back to Lee just for any final comments, anything that hasn't been said yet that you want to say, also to plug anything, because I want to respect your time, Lee.
Well, I'll just on the World War III comments, I'll just say, yeah, these are bloodthirsty, belligerent lunatics, and I'd say the U.S. system and I guess the Israel system as well, uniquely rises to the top sociopaths. And the estimates are that like 1 out of every 100 people is a sociopath. It can vary, but and so that's okay. Those people don't need to be jailed or anything, but you need to have a system that doesn't uniquely rise them to the top, which is what our system does. Who's on the boards of the largest corporations in the world? Who's in the Oval Office? Who's in Congress? It's almost exclusively people who are willing to step on the throats of others in order to get ahead. And then you end up with this absolutely preposterous, insane system. Of course, money has a lot to do with it as well. But yeah, they're now talking about tactical nukes. Like that's like, we just need a better way to use nuclear weapons. It's utterly insane. It's all disgusting. And it's an inverted moral universe where they try and tell us that genocide is just and right. And if you're not supporting genocide, then you're on the side of the terrorists. It's just pure lunacy. And that's why I like chatting with some sane human beings like you two gentlemen. But yeah, I do have to run. I'm sorry. But I love doing
you're
this.
good.
And thank you, Danny, for having me on. And
Yeah.
for anybody who wants to check out my stuff, I've live streamed 4 to 5 days a week. And it's on YouTube, it's on Rumble, Dangerous Ideas, but you can find it all at leecamp.com.
Yes, and find that YouTube channel and also leecamp.com on that. I believe you do link it in the YouTube channel too, in the video description. Thanks so much, Lee. Lee, we'll be in touch because I know I'll hop on your program.
Yeah,
very soon.
I'm having both of you on soon. So
yes, good, great. All right, Lee.
Great to see you,
Take
Lee.
care. Have a good night. All right, Ben. How about we get to some? I know you've been covering de-dollarization a lot, so how about I did pull up some things on this I wanted to talk to you about. So, I don't know if you've noticed, Ben, that whenever I at least when I'm scouring news articles on de-dollarization, you often find that publications like mainstream media, they're trying to catch up to developments. So, I was trying to see what the latest word on this is. And here you have Bloomberg talking about China dumping a record amount of U.S. stocks and bonds. But what they're really referencing is back in May, a huge amount of stocks and bonds from the United States, 42.6 billion, were dumped, and many see this as a move toward de-dollarization. Now, I also wanted to show, because this was reported earlier back in May by many different publications, but here is Yahoo or Business Insider, as reported by Yahoo Finance, talking about $53.3 billion worth of treasuries and agency bonds back in the first quarter of 2024. So, you have de-dollarization accelerating, you have BRICS meeting in October. Talk about especially the role of Russia and China, because these are the two, I think, focal points of de-dollarization. Talk about what's been going on in this regard, because I know, it's kind of happening everywhere. Venezuela has its elections on Sunday. I know Venezuela has been moving in this direction to stabilize its own economic situation. But it's happening. You spent a lot of time in Nicaragua. It's happening everywhere. So could you talk about this development?
Yeah, this is so important. And you're right. What's funny is, for a few years now, the financial press's narrative was that de-dollarization is not happening. It's a crazy conspiracy. And then in the past few years, the narrative has changed and they say, well, it's happening, but it's happening very slowly. And the US dollar is not going anywhere at the end of the day. And ultimately, I will say that I disagree with some of the extreme bulls who say, that obviously this idea that the dollar is super powerful and is never going anywhere. That's obviously ridiculous. Like the US dollar's hegemony is falling very rapidly. But at the same time, I also disagree with a lot of the extreme bears who say like the dollar is going to be toilet paper. I mean, in reality, I think one of the mainstream economists who really understands this well is Zoltan Pozsar, who was previously at Bank Suisse, which obviously, is like it was taken over by UBS. So what's actually happening is that more and more countries, especially non-Western countries, are seeking alternatives to the US dollar in two different ways. And when we talk about this, it has to be two different. There is de-dollarization of international savings, not only in the sense of the foreign exchange reserves that are held by central banks, but also of investments that are held. So you mentioned, for instance, that investors in China have been dumping their US holdings, probably because they're afraid of US sanctions freezing them out. And then there's also de-dollarization of foreign exchange reserves of central banks. So I'll talk about that in a moment. But then there's also simultaneously the de-dollarization of the international settlement of trade. Now, this is even more quick. This is happening very, very rapidly. So what we see is that Russia and China now, they're doing 95% of their bilateral trade in renminbi, also known as yuan, and Russian rubles. So they've removed the use of the US dollar in their bilateral trade. What does that mean? It means that when China and Russia settle their trade, which is done through, importers and exporters, etc., they're using their local currencies. Similarly, India and Russia are using local currencies. Iran and Russia and China are using local currencies. We also see many other regions of the world. So, for instance, China and Brazil signed an agreement to de-dollarize their bilateral trade using yuan and also the real, which is the Brazilian currency. We saw that in Southeast Asia, the ASEAN countries have created a new financial architecture to de-dollarize their international trade, their bilateral trade between different countries, and created new payment mechanisms as well for instance, tourists from Indonesia who go to Malaysia, they can simply use their local banking system. So this is all happening very, very quickly. And that actually is in some ways kind of easier. And I do expect us to see much more of that. In Africa, the African Union is talking about trying to do something similar for bilateral trade in the region. However, what we're also seeing is de-dollarization of savings. So I was talking about de-dollarization of trade. In some ways, that's actually the easiest part. De-dollarization of savings is a bit more complicated. Why? Well, because currencies have multiple purposes. Currencies are a means of exchange, but they're also a unit of account and a store of value. Those are the 3 points, the three main uses of a currency. And a store of value is something very important because what we do see is that, for instance, the Brazilian real, it suffers from a higher inflation rate than the US dollar. So a lot of countries like China, if it's going to trade with Brazil, it might, if it has excess Brazilian reals, it might not want to save those. It's going to want to either look for some kind of asset to invest them in or convert that to some other currency in order to buy another asset. So what we see, for instance, is an issue right now in between Russia and India. Russia and India are trying to de-dollarize their trade. But what happens is that Russia has a trade surplus with India. India buys a lot of very cheap oil below market value from Russia, buys wheat, buys minerals. And then India has a trade deficit. So that means that there's an outflow of Indian rupees that end up in the Russian banking system. The Russian central bank has all of these Indian rupees. What does it do? Well, the Indian rupee is not fully, the capital account in India is not fully open. There are capital controls, which is a good thing. I mean, it's like China. So it's not fully convertible. So that means that Russia could try to buy some more products from India, but there are only so many products from India that it wants to buy. It's not like China, which produces everything. So you get this issue where, what are you going to do with that excess currency? So what we actually now see is that basically all central banks are buying gold. And not only in the BRICS countries, not only in the global South, even many Western central banks are buying more and more gold. And what we're seeing is essentially gold is becoming the new reserve asset, but that doesn't mean that the gold standard is coming back, because then you get like these dumb libertarians who want to go back to the gold standard, these gold bugs, which is nonsense. No one is going back to the gold standard. That would be a crazy idea. It would be extremely deflationary. It would cause extreme economic contractions. That's not what they're doing. What they're doing is they're using gold as the reserve asset to settle balance of payments differences. So if a country has a trade deficit, like China actually has a trade deficit with Brazil, as an example. So Brazil exports more to China than China exports to Brazil. So instead of settling that trade imbalance in dollars, they can simply settle it in gold between their central banks. And what we see more and more is the financial press is acknowledging that gold is becoming an extremely important asset. And that's also one of the main reasons that the price of gold has risen very significantly in the past few years. It's also because of inflation in the US, and gold is typically an inflation hedge. However, what we've seen is something very unique. The US Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, rose interest rates in the past 2 years at the highest level since 1979, since the famous Volcker shock. And usually, when the Fed raises interest rates, that actually tends to be bearish for gold. Gold prices tend to fall against the dollar because the dollar is increasing in value against other major currencies because the higher interest rates. But what we've seen is that the dollar has rallied against other currencies, but gold has also rallied with the US dollar, which shows that this is not simply being driven by market forces. This is also geopolitical, because more and more central banks around the world are stocking up on gold. Now, why is this important? Well, what we also see is that the Chinese central bank, the People's Bank of China, has been dumping US Treasury securities even faster than many of us who talk about de-dollarization thought. We've seen data in recent months that now the People's Bank of China's holdings of US Treasury securities, which is US government debt, as a percentage of Chinese GDP, is at the lowest level since 2001, when China joined the World Trade Organization. And if you look at a chart of China's holdings of Treasury securities as a percentage of GDP, it's like an elephant, right? It was very, very low until about 2001, when China joined the WTO. It rose very rapidly. It peaked around 2014 and has fallen ever since. And in fact, if you simply look at the PBOC's overall holdings, not as a percentage of GDP, simply the value of the Treasury securities it holds, they peaked in 2014. People argue about why that is. It could be partially because of quantitative easing that the Federal Reserve was carrying out. And then people said, why would we invest in this US debt when the US government is printing trillions of dollars? But actually, I think an even more important factor, that's what the financial analysts talk about. They ignore the geopolitics. I think another very important factor is in 2014, the US backed the coup in Ukraine. It overthrew Ukraine's democratically elected government, installed a pro-Western, pro-NATO regime that said it wanted to join NATO. They started this proxy war on Russia. And then the US put very heavy sanctions on Russia over Crimea. And the PBOC said, wow, the West just put huge sanctions on Russia. We could be next. We should start diversifying our foreign exchange reserves. So this is not something that just happened in the past few years. It's been happening for a decade now. But what we've seen in the past few years in particular is a very significant acceleration of this process. And even I've done a lot of reporting on this at my channel, Geopolitical Economy Report. And I have talked about how now, a few months ago, even the Federal Reserve itself in the US, economists at the Fed published a research paper acknowledging that de-dollarization is happening. The IMF has published numerous research papers talking about how de-dollarization is happening. And in both of their most recent research papers, which I talked about in a recent video, both IMF economists and Fed economists acknowledged that gold is essentially becoming, for central banks, for them to de-dollarize their savings, their reserves, gold is becoming the de facto asset. So essentially, in the short term, gold is becoming the BRICS currency to settle trade imbalances. And in the medium to the long term, according to President Putin, they're talking about this idea of trying to create some kind of neutral reserve asset, going back to the concept that was created by the renowned economist John Maynard Keynes at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. He made this big proposal for what he referred to as the Bancor, which would be a basket. It would be a unit of account that would be based on a basket of different currencies, the major currencies of the major economies. And it would also be a way of trying to help maintain better trade balances between countries by punishing countries with large chronic trade deficits and trade surpluses. So I still think in the medium to the long term, there is a lot of discussion going on also in Latin America. President Lula da Silva is talking about this. There's a lot of debate about how to create a new international unit of account. But in the short term, what we're seeing is actually even more rapid de-dollarization of foreign exchange reserves than even some of us, who've been talking about this for years, than even we thought. And now mainstream economists at the Fed and the IMF are acknowledging it.
Yeah, definitely. And perhaps you can follow up now on the role of economic war, because the economists can be so instructive. So, and you talked a lot about the role of commodities and de-dollarization. So here you have the economist sounding the alarm about secret commodity stockpiles from China, right? China, gas, right? These very valuable commodities, the minerals needed for technology, all kinds of commodities, wheat, food. I want to just scroll down because I don't want to bore the statistics how they're doing at what the conclusion of this is, because all of this is framed around China stockpiling resources because of the potential for an even more hostile U.S. policy and even more hostile economic war, where the United States cuts China off from key routes. And here it says, for now, evidence suggests the hoarding is more likely a defensive measure, and it's not yet at the scale to be secure in a hot conflict. American officials must hope that does not change in the years to come. Officials must hope that does not change. So talk about, because a lot of this acceleration of de-dollarization and the preparations that especially the major powers of the multipolar world, Russia and China, but really, everyone that has embraced, especially as you said, settling trade, whether it's trade imbalances, bilateral trade between countries, that is accelerated to a much higher degree than maybe this conversation about a new currency. But the economic war that is being leveled upon even the biggest and most powerful and most stable countries. I mean, Russia, a big reason why it has become such a focal point of de-dollarization is because of the tens of thousands of sanctions on it. So Ben, could you talk about the role of this, given that you literally have the economists saying, the U.S. better hope that China is never secure enough economically, does not stockpile enough of its enough resources that it can survive a hot war?
Well, according to that logic, the U.S. is also preparing for war because the U.S. has something called a strategic petroleum reserve, in which the U.S. stockpiles huge sums, millions of barrels of oil that it needs for emergencies. And in fact, the Biden administration took a lot of that oil out of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the SPR, in order to try to bring down oil prices in the lead up to the 2022 midterm elections. I mean, this is nonsense. China has been doing this for many years. It's not new. China has always done this, and also for other reasons, because China has a socialist system. And one of the most important things that the Chinese policymakers try to do is maintain macroeconomic stability. They don't want these massive fluctuations in prices of key commodities, which can lead to inflation. And especially, China is the world's factory. China represents 35% of world gross production of manufacturing. The US is less than half. China produces everything. And in order to produce those kinds of things, you need a lot of commodities, a lot of oil, a lot of gas, a lot of copper, a lot of steel, a lot of iron ore. I mean, the list goes on and on. Cobalt. And what we see is that some of these commodities that China has been stockpiling, they've been doing this for many years, but in the past few years, they have been increasing that stockpiling, I would say, for a few reasons. One, there was a global inflation crisis. Obviously, if you have massive increases in commodity prices, what a country can do if it actually plans and thinks ahead and doesn't just think in terms of quarterly reports for maximizing shareholder value and profits, what China does is they say, okay, we're going to probably need a lot of copper and cobalt and oil in the future. So let's stockpile on it when prices are low, so that when prices rise, we can release some of that from our stockpile and we can reduce prices in the local market, which is exactly what China does, which is one of the reasons that inflation has been very low in China. And I mentioned that the US has a strategic petroleum reserve. China also has their strategic petroleum reserve. So, I mean, part of this is simply because China, again, policymakers actually plan for the medium to the long term. They don't just think about short-term profits. Now, furthermore, I do think it actually is fair to say that China is stockpiling in case there is some kind of conflict, because you have a bunch of warmongering maniacs in Washington who are every single week saying that they want a war against mainland China over Taiwan province. And we see US generals saying that they foresee a US war on China as soon as 2025. You can say that these are part of the Mad Men tactics to try to scare China, but it's very rational and very logical. If a major military superpower is threatening war on you constantly, obviously you're going to make preparations. And this is also, by the way, something that we see with energy security. China has been building pipelines, more and more pipelines with Russia, including the Power of Siberia 1 and 2 pipelines. China has been making deals with Iran and making more and more trade routes through the Belt and Road Initiative. China has been making agreements to de-dollarize trade for oil and gas with some of the Gulf regimes. And President Xi, 2 years ago, he visited Saudi Arabia and he announced publicly that China is making agreements on the Shanghai Oil and Gas Exchange to buy oil and gas from the Gulf region in yuan. And we've seen that China has already purchased liquefied natural gas, LNG, from the UAE using yuan. And recently, the Saudi Central Bank joined an initiative that's being led by China, which is called M-Bridge, which is a way of connecting the central banks of China, the UAE, Thailand, and now Saudi Arabia. And they can use their own local currencies through central bank digital currencies, which libertarians are telling you to be afraid of. But actually, US banks on Wall Street have been lobbying very hard against CBDCs. Wall Street hates the idea of a CBDC, not because of surveillance or whatever. I mean, the US government already uses private commercial banks to spy on people through anti-money laundering policies and money. And, there are so many policies that already exist in which the US can spy on people. But one of the reasons that Wall Street banks are afraid of the idea of CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, is because it could cut out the middlemen of private banks and people could simply have retail accounts and they could bank with their central bank. And this is what China is doing. It's what many countries are doing. And China is also very interested in CBDCs because it's a way of cutting out the middlemen of correspondent banks based in the US, in New York or Florida. So China, the People's Bank of China, the Central Bank of the UAE, the Central Bank of Saudi Arabia, they can settle trade imbalances directly using their own currencies through CBDCs. No need for any other correspondent banks, no need for dollars. So China has been carrying out all of these policies that provide more energy security in case the US decides one day, not only are we going to cut off Chinese private, there are almost no private banks in China, but So the vast majority of the Chinese banking system is publicly owned. So the difference between the non-central bank and the central bank are actually not that big. But, you know, China has these massive 4 banks that are, you know, the ICBC, the Bank of China, the Agricultural Bank of China. These are huge banks that have trillions and trillions of dollars of assets. They're the 4 biggest banks on earth, and they're all state-owned. And they deal with the Chinese central bank in order to deal with international trade imbalances. And what China is doing is saying that we are now sanction-proofing our entire financial system. We are finding ways that if the U.S. decides to cut those banks off from the SWIFT system, we can continue doing trade, settle trade imbalances by simply going directly through the central bank. And furthermore, there's also a geopolitical element because China's imports of oil and other commodities rely very heavily on a few geostrategic choke points, including the Strait of Hormuz and including the Malacca Strait. And if you read research papers from think tankers in Washington, like, for instance, you know, some of these, like the Brookings Institution, or if you read stuff from the Rand Corporation, which is, you know, a Pentagon-backed group, they talk about how if there's a war against mainland China over Taiwan province, they can try to starve China of oil by blocking the Malacca Strait. Or the nuclear option would be blocking the Strait of Hormuz. So China is trying to find ways, not only through stockpiles, but also of creating new trade routes that will allow it to simply continue not only, you know, operating a basic economy, but being this manufacturing superpower. You need huge sums of resources. So, I mean, obviously the economists, they're trying to push a particular narrative. As Lenin famously said, he said this over 100 years ago. He wrote that The Economist was the journal of the British millionaires. You can say today, The Economist is the propaganda mouthpiece of the international transatlantic billionaire oligarch class. But the point is that The Economist is always trying to push this narrative that China is one week away from supposedly invading Taiwan province, which is nonsense. They're not planning on doing that. But China is, again, making medium to long-term plans in case the U.S. tries to do a Ukraine, like what they did to Russia, to China. And China is not going to allow the U.S. to suffocate it economically. And that's why the West is so angry, because there's like, do everything that we want you to do so we can strangle you.
Yeah, indeed. How are you feeling, Ben? I had one more story, but if you're not, okay. All right. If you're feeling good, we can keep going because, you know, I wanted to talk about the security side of this, the military side of the multipolar world, because I think there's a lot of enthusiasts. I don't know if you get this from your audience, but I know here there's a lot of enthusiasts who really want, you know, they really want the multipolar world to ramp up their security and begin the process of essentially outmoding the US's military hegemony, right? I think that's a lot of comments, I guess. When is Russia and China going to make this military alliance? But I wanted to talk to you about, because there's been a recent development with regard to Russia and China getting closer militarily. I mean, we had, of course, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization admit Belarus, and then China and Belarus conducted military drills. Belarus has been conducting nuclear drills, tactical nuclear drills with Russia. Now, Russia and China, they do this every single year. They have a series of naval drills, and now they are coordinating between their air forces, in particular strategic bombers. And I just want to show what's been going on, because these bombers, Chinese and Russian bombers, have been flying in their operation. I believe this began on July 24th, 25th. I'll just play a short video. I'm going to play it on mute because I cannot stand the jet noise. It's only a few seconds, so that's really relevant. So here's some Russia Ministry of Defense footage, and then there's a really interesting and strange message at the end that I'll stop there, and then we'll play Lloyd Austin's response. So here is the footage. According to the United States, they intercepted these bombers, whatever that's supposed to mean in this sense. But they did not enter sovereign airspace of the United States or Canada. But it is the first time that strategic bombers from China and Russia, who they're calling U.S. adversaries. And look at this. I don't know who made this video, but they said war is not the way for China and Russia. I find that to be incredibly ironic. But I now want to play Lloyd Austin's brief response to this because, while he does attempt to speak confidently, I think there's a lot of hedging around conflict with China and Russia, and of course, the realities that such a conflict is not as easy as maybe it might have been in the past.
Regarding the Russian and Chinese aircrafts that flew together in the north here recently, this was not a surprise to us. We closely monitored these aircraft, tracked the aircraft, intercepted the aircraft, and which demonstrates that our forces are at the ready all the time, and we have very good surveillance capabilities, and of course I won't discuss any intelligence issues here at the podium, but again, it's the first time that we've seen these two countries fly together like that. They didn't enter our airspace. I think the closest point of approach was about 200 miles off of our coast. So, but this is a thing that we track very closely. We're able to intercept, and if it happens again, if there's any kind of challenge from any direction, I have every confidence that NORTHCOM and NORAD will be at the ready and will be able to intercept.
So that's what's going on. This happens when it comes to naval drills. This happens whenever Russia and China cooperate in any kind of way. There's always this scare that Russia and China are readying for war with the United States. But the reality is that as Lavrov and Wang Yi talking at the ASEAN Foreign Ministry Summit, they're talking about a new security architecture. But Ben, is this a security architecture for a war against the United States, or is it something else?
I mean, it's such nonsense. Again, this is what we were talking about earlier, how the Western media and Western governments, because of course the Western media, it simply regurgitates what Western governments say. They constantly say that China is 1 week away from supposedly invading Taiwan, blah, blah, blah. The reality is the exact opposite. I don't know the Russian perspective as much. I mean, I know it through the media, reading Russian media and such. But as someone, I normally live in China. I'm currently in Nicaragua for a few months, but I'm going to be back in China in September. And I talked to so many people in Chinese universities and Chinese think tanks and Chinese former officials and such. And I've learned a lot about how they think. They're not in any way planning for war. They don't want war. On the contrary, if you ask what Chinese officials are thinking about, they'll say very clearly, one, we ended extreme poverty, but we want to continue developing because many people in China, especially in rural areas, still have very low incomes. We want to raise their incomes and create common prosperity. We want to increase the development in less developed regions, like, for instance, the rural areas, the Western provinces. They want to better integrate China. They want another huge concern that they're very focused on is more technological sovereignty, so they're not dependent on importing more advanced manufacturing products like semiconductors. They want to create their own sovereign technology so they can create not only their own airplanes, which they've been doing, but they can use local parts to create those airplanes. These are the kinds of things that people in China are focused on. They're focused on trying to bring down real estate prices without causing a major crisis in the economy. They're focused on trying to raise employment for young, educated people. They're trying to decrease inequality. That's what occupies the vast majority of Chinese officials' time. They're not just sitting around thinking, all right, next week is perfect to invade Taiwan. This is just a complete fantasy that the Western media has fabricated to justify Western aggression against China. If you listen to what Chinese officials say in both public and private, they're very clear about it. They say, time is on our side. We're not worried about like wanting to invade Taiwan or any of this nonsense. What we want to focus on is what they're doing, is increasing more interchange between the mainland and Taiwan province, making it easier for people to travel from the mainland to Taiwan province, increasing trade and economic interchange. And their view is that over time, the force of economic inertia, momentum will push toward deepening integration and reunification. They don't want a war. It's the US that is pushing for this. I mean, if you actually spend time in mainland China and you talk to Chinese people, average people, policymakers, intellectuals, academics, researchers, you start going crazy when you listen to what they say and then you read the Western media. It is completely fake. Completely fake. They do not want a war. It's the last thing they want. First of all, they see the people in Taiwan as their brothers and sisters. They're all part of China. The last thing they want is a war against their brothers and sisters. There are so many families in mainland China who have family members living in Taiwan province, and vice versa. People on Taiwan Island who have family members living in mainland China. This is, again, it's just such a fantasy. So China, of course, is doing what it can to defend its sovereignty, prevent extremist secessionist forces in Taiwan from trying to cause a war. And of course, they only represent a small minority. If you interview people on Taiwan Island, and there have been polls done by mainstream Western firms, they show that the vast majority of people on Taiwan Island want the status quo. They do not want independence. A small minority of people want independence. They want the status quo, to go along with things as they are. And if you talk to people in mainland China, they know that time is on their side, which is why extreme hawks in Washington and extreme secessionists in Taiwan, they're the ones who want war because they know time is not on their side. They know that in the decades to come, the mainland and Taiwan will come closer and closer together. So that's their concern. That's why we see so much of this propaganda. But it's just like, you see these people like Gordon Chang, who have been saying literally for decades now that China is on the verge of collapse. China is going to collapse. The coming collapse of China.
I don't know if you've caught also Peter Zahan, who's big on the YouTube streets. He's the same. I mean, he literally goes on. He's like in the middle of the mountains somewhere in the United States. And he's like, okay, 10 minutes on why China's going to collapse. No proof, evidence, anything. And, it's eaten up, but continue.
The supposed coming invasion of Taiwan is exactly the same. It's always exactly 1 year away. It's always 1 year away. Next year, they say now it's going to be in 2025. Next year, it's going to be in 2026. In 2026, it's going to be in 2027. However, I will say there is a circumstance in which it will happen, which is some kind of crazy extremists in Taiwan declare independence in alliance with some hawks in Washington. And there are some crazy people in Washington who would try to pursue that. Someone like maybe if Mike Pompeo comes back in a second Trump term, they might try to do that. But honestly, if you actually read some of the internal reports of some of these think tanks in Washington or like the Rand Corporation, they know they've done war games. There are basically no circumstances in which they win. In the best circumstance, mainland China doesn't win, but Taiwan is destroyed. That's in the best case scenario, according to war games done by US think tanks. And they actually don't want that either, because one of the world's biggest semiconductor companies is TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, which the US is very heavily reliant on. And now through the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, the US is trying to bring some of those manufacturing jobs back to the US, and the US is actually giving billions of dollars of subsidies and loans to TSMC to make factories in the US, specifically in Arizona. They've talked about making 4 factories. But the irony is that it's been completely unsuccessful because the US, through the neoliberal era, it's financialized its economy, it's deindustrialized, and you can't just rebuild that manufacturing base overnight. It's very difficult. They don't even have the skilled workers who know how to operate this machinery to make advanced semiconductors. So ironically, what we're seeing is that TSMC not only is building these factories in Arizona with billions of subsidies from the US government, but they're also having to send workers from Taiwan to Arizona. And then they get there and they're having horrible experiences living in the US and realizing how, in many ways, the US quality of life is horrible with healthcare and bad public education, all this stuff. So, I mean, the idea that they can just have a war and then they'll win it, they won't win it. They'll destroy Taiwan, which means they destroy the main source of the semiconductors, and they destroy any possibility they have of trying to build a military base on Taiwan, which is the US goal. That's the US goal, is to weaken China, divide the Chinese people, to put this thorn in the side of China, and it's to build a US military base on Taiwan, which is what the US had until the normalization of relations with China in the 1970s. And we have documents from the National Security Archive, and which is at George Washington University in DC, and they have declassified documents that prove that the US military had nuclear weapons stored on Taiwan Island up until the 1970s, and they were forced to take them out as part of the rapprochement. And we now know also that during the second Taiwan Strait crisis, we know this because of the documents that were leaked by the leaker of the Pentagon Papers, Daniel Ellsberg, who recently passed away, a great hero in the fight against war and empire. He exposed how in the second Taiwan Strait crisis in the Eisenhower administration, the US military came very close to nuking mainland China using the nuclear weapons they had stored in their base on Taiwan, which were aimed directly at mainland China. They came very close to doing that. So that's why they want, once again, to turn Taiwan into what they refer to an unsinkable aircraft carrier for war on mainland China. And those are the only extreme scenarios in which China would be prepared for war. But again, China is trying to do everything it can to prevent war. They do not want war.
Yeah, and I think this is why it's important to also notice how China, as Lavrov and Wang Yi, foreign ministers of Russia and China, as they talk about new security architecture, they're not talking about military alliances. They're not talking about how do we build up the bilateral, multilateral military capacity to wage a war. What they're really talking about is how do they deter any kind of potential war. And in that sense, when China not only, because China does and is investing in its military, and of course we know Russia has been doing so heavily because it is literally at war with NATO. They are saying that an alliance is not really necessary, because as long as they build up the capacity to protect their own sovereignty, really any kind of coordination militarily is all about that. It's all about keeping actual peace. It's like literal and real deterrence that not only military strategists talk about, but what people who talk about international law and talk about, what is appropriate militarization, what is appropriate defense. It's hard for people in the United States, I think, and the collective West to understand this, because their governments and their militaries are not building up any kind of defense. They are building up offense. They're building up wars. But any comments on that? Because a lot of people who follow our work, I know, really anytime they view Russia and China conducting any kind of military cooperation, talking about security, they're always hoping almost, in some ways, I understand it, that a military alliance is going to be formed, because I think that people see in that, well, if a military alliance is formed, then the multipolar world is completely protected, and there's, and the danger will recede from the unipolar world side. But and your final comments on this before we...
Yeah, a few thoughts. You raised some good points, Danny. First of all, China's foreign policy, you have to understand, comes really out of the non-aligned movement. Technically, China was not part of the non-aligned movement formally, but China has always been very, linked to it. And China is also linked to the G77, which grew out of the non-aligned movement. It's the group of 77, which today actually has around 140 countries. They represent the vast majority of the world. And in their meetings, they always have summits, and they're called G77 plus China. Now, when I say that, what I want to emphasize is that when we think about the first Cold War, of course, we think about the US-led imperialist bloc, the Soviet-led socialist bloc. You have NATO, which was created first, and then the Warsaw Pact was created in response to NATO, specifically in response to the US incorporating Germany into NATO, which not only enraged Russia, which was the leader of the Soviet Union, but also was a security threat to the Soviet Union, right? So today, Russia does have some security alliances. For instance, President Putin visited Pyongyang and signed a security pact with the DPRK. Very important, very historic. China, on the other hand, has always had a much more non-aligned approach, and China is very careful about formal alliances. So China and Russia have made it very clear. They literally have said this multiple times. They have the best relations in their history, the best relations they've ever had. They said it's as strong as a rock. Everything. It's better than a friendship. All of these things, right? But it's technically not a formal alliance. Why is that? For a variety of reasons. Again, China is very hesitant about getting involved in foreign conflicts, and it could also, in some ways, jeopardize their security, not strengthen their security. Why do I say that? Well, take an example like this. People say China and Iran should sign a security pact. Well, what that means is that what if the US starts a war on Iran? Then that means they would force China to get involved, which means you immediately have World War III. Now, obviously, if there's some kind of war with Iran, it could easily go to World War III, even if there's not a formal China-Iran defense pact. But you can see that signing a security pact does not necessarily make you more secure. It could actually make you less secure. And China does not want war. Again, this is something that's the Western countries that have been at war for centuries, it's so deeply embedded in the political system. These are colonizing imperialist countries. China has not been at war, excluding some border disputes, really since the 1970s, with what was essentially an extension of the US war in Vietnam, which ended up spilling over into China. And there was, unfortunately, a very brief war between China and Vietnam. But aside from that, China has not really been at war since the Korean War, since the 1950s. And China wants to keep it that way. And by not engaging in a formal security pact, they see that as one of the best ways to, ironically, to maintain their security, because then they only have to concern about their own direct security concerns, right? And another way that we should think about this, which is very important, is I think Vietnam and China, despite their political disputes, they have very similar ways of approaching foreign policy. Now, there are some very ignorant people who claim that because Vietnam has good relations with the US, that Vietnam's allying with the US against China. That's not true in any way. You know this, Danny. You've been to Vietnam. You've explained this very well in your videos. That's not what's happening. Vietnam has a non-aligned policy. They also do not join formal alliances with other countries because they see that as the best way to maintain their security and their independence. China pursues a very similar policy. So they also have very good relations with Vietnam, by the way. And people talk about how Vietnam upgraded its relations with the US to a partnership, whatever. But actually, they already did that with China years before. So despite the fact that Vietnam does have good relations with the US, they have even better relations with China. So, I mean, they try to have good relations with everyone because they want to focus on economic development, lifting their people out of poverty, developing their infrastructure, developing their technology. The same thing in China, because they have socialist governments that don't want war. They're not worried about imperialism, like they don't, in the sense that they don't want to be empires. They don't want to extract the capital of foreign countries, and they don't want to, they're not worried about foreign capital accumulation. They're worried about local domestic development. They're not imperialist economies. They're focused on development. So when people talk about why China doesn't form a security alliance with Russia, etc., because they don't do that with anyone. I mean, I think probably Russia would like that because they already did one with the DPRK, and maybe the situation will become so dangerous with the U.S. aggression, especially if NATO continues to expand and South Korea and Japan are officially incorporated, and the Philippines is incorporated. Maybe China will be forced to sign a larger security agreement. But the reality is that if it's up to China, they want to keep it the way that it is, which is they have very good relations with Russia and very good relations with Iran and other countries, but they're not forced into a formal security pact.
Yeah. Yes, that's 100%. You know, on the Vietnam question, you know, going to Vietnam and China is very interesting because Vietnam feels like probably where China felt like it was maybe in the 80s and 90s, growing rapidly, but still very underdeveloped and still with a long way to go in terms of building up the productive forces and addressing some pretty basic problems. And that means Vietnam has said, no, we are not going to choose any kind of sides, regardless. And in some ways, I'm like, well, if you just lean a little more toward China, some of these issues that you have domestically in terms of economic development might, might resolve, especially around infrastructure. But, you know, at the same time, it also helps to not have the United States sanctioning you, which is what happened to Vietnam for all the way up until the end of the Cold War, a little bit afterwards. So, you know, there's that. And then I don't believe China, you know, my position, and we can close and, you know, I'll just go over super chats really quick. My position is that China and Russia don't really need to form a military. As you said, maybe they might have to, but they don't really need to because they're neighbors, so they can cooperate. They have the terrain. They can, you know, they can conduct these drills like they were doing close to the Alaska border, but really it was totally within the parameters of international law. They can do these things. They can conduct naval. They can cooperate where it's necessary because they do have joint security interests, but they don't have to form an alliance because, you know, that would mean, as you said, Ben, they would have to go into Ukraine. They would have to, you know, they would have to make Russia's problems their own. They would have to make Iran's problems their own. And I don't think the other side wants that either. Iran, Russia, it creates more problems than it resolves for right now. But I think I think we can see the architecture, the global security initiative that China has. We can see Russia and how it's navigating its own security situation regionally and globally. I think it all points to they're not unaware of the threats, but they're moving as delicately as possible to prevent what is the unthinkable. I think at the end of the day, a lot of geopolitical questions for the multipolar world ends up, you know, being how far can we go before the unthinkable, you know, is very real, because the United States and its allies, if we can call them that, they've brought us to this point. But any final words? I'll start pulling up some super chats just to thank people. But
yeah,
Ben, any final words?
Put it very
we
well, Danny. I'll just briefly add that instead of thinking about these kind of partnerships as alliances, it's better just to think of them as, you know, kind of blocks. I don't know what the best word is. Like, I use the word block, but then sometimes, you know, actually,
then the Chinese will be like, "What are
Yeah, they'll say
no.
we oppose block mentality. I mean,
Yes.
but I think that in the sense that you could say there's this kind of like the BRICS block, like there are these developing countries, formerly colonized countries that have a common interest and they share a lot in common that they want to work together on. I still don't know what the best word is. You could say partnership, but that's not, a partnership is between two countries, right? So I don't know what the best word is, but I think, again, when we talk about an alliance, it means something very specific. NATO is an alliance, and according to Article 5, if a NATO member is invaded, the other NATO members have to get involved, which means if there is this formal alliance, it's so easy to become World War III. And as we've been speaking about here for 2 hours, China is trying to do everything it can to prevent World War III. So, but ironically, again, just because a country joins a security pact and forms a formal alliance, that doesn't mean they're actually more secure. It ironically could make them less secure. So these things are very complicated. And again, just because there's not a formal alliance between China, Russia, and Iran doesn't mean that they're not very close partners. They absolutely are. And they will support each other when they're victims of aggression, as we've seen, like in the case of Iran. They have supported Iran with sanctions relief. They know that it's a victim of Western aggression. They all mutually support each other. And as you said, you don't need to have a formal security pact to do that.
Indeed. So let's just go over these real quick because I want to end with you, Ben, because I definitely want to talk to you privately for like a minute. So Gusandra on Patreon. So if you're watching, subscribe on Patreon. You can submit questions, comments, and I usually read them first. So Gusandra says, thank you. We have Kimberly Mims, who has been commenting the whole time. I want to thank you. And then Jack had a question if you wanted to answer for like 10, 30 seconds, Ben. Isn't China developing semiconductor technology and chips now? And how large is China's output in that department relative to Taiwan? I mean, that's a very good question. If you want to.
Yeah, quick answer. Okay, so it depends what kind of chips.
Right.
Now, this has become a huge issue. And now people talk about the chip war, right? There's a new book, it's the Chip Wars. And so in the most advanced high-tech chips, China is still quite a bit behind. However, just in just a few years, China has made huge progress, especially more recently this past year with the new Huawei phone, the Mate 60 Pro. They had a huge breakthrough. And China has its own partially state-owned company, which people call SMIC, S-M-I-C, which is their own semiconductor company. And what we've also seen is recent reports that although China is still trying to catch up and is probably maybe 3 to 5 years behind in the most advanced chips, what it's not behind in is all of the what they call legacy chips. So the irony is there actually have been some reports recently that the US sanctions and export restrictions have turned China into a global leader in legacy chips. In all of the main chips that we use for our computers and phones and cameras, the vast majority of chips in the world, they don't need to be the most high-tech chips, right? And China is now the world's leader in that technology. So this is the ultimate irony, is that the more the US sanctions, it actually increases China's technological sovereignty and security, and it's now leading China to have more market share overall in the entire semiconductor industry.
Yeah. When I was in China in July 2023, a lot of people were talking about how the sanctions on Huawei actually successfully blocked a model of their phone, of a Huawei phone, before the Mate Pro 60 came out. So they had to remain at 4G. They could not move forward. And then the Huawei Mate Pro 60 comes out with the most advanced, basically a year later. So that's how fast things can really move. So thank you for becoming a new member. I don't even want to try this, but thank you. Laxgor Moller. I don't know if I did that right, but thank you. Thank you, Speaking Truth to Peace. Give peace a chance. Studio Rainer, thank you so much for this generous super chat. Political dissidence is completely disconnected from reality. Strangely similar to the Weimar Republic. A revolution in some form is coming. We don't know what it'll look like. Americans are not united to fight any war on a large scale. This is indeed true.
Yeah,
thank you so much.
Just a quick thought. Pretty much every revolution in modern history has come out of a war. Right. If you think about the Bolshevik Revolution, the Korean Revolution, the Vietnamese Revolution, the Portuguese Revolution, the Carnation Revolution. I mean, so I think you're actually right that if the U.S. leadership, the political class, is so crazy that they try to start some kind of direct conventional war with China, the U.S. political system is so dysfunctional. There's so much disunity. It could lead to a revolution or some kind of domestic chaos. And if people are conscripted, they will not go and fight.
No, especially, and this is no longer let's bomb Iraq to the oblivion, to the Stone Age, like a video game. You're talking about major powers and,
mass casualties on the U.S. side.
I mean, all the war games, as you said, from, the Center for New American Security, they've all said there's going to be a lot of people who die on all sides if a war were to break out, especially between the U.S. and China. With Russia, the nuclear, they don't even factor in the nuclear question because they ignore that because they believe that could never happen. But so Janice, thank you so much. Great trio. So Sam says, so I get this position, but at the same time, I can let you answer this, Ben. In terms of, if not now, when. I don't know where you were hailing from, Sam. I appreciate the super chat. In the West, because I'm based U.S. I know, Ben, you are now a traveler, but also from the United States. I'm like, when are we going to, when do we build up the capacity for people to take responsibility in a mass way, not like Reagan responsibility, but like when we actually for the fact that it's our government, it is the foreign policy coming from our so-called representatives. I feel like that's where we need to start, because I think this is in relation, that question, to Russia and China, maybe their policy. So if you want to respond in just a few seconds.
Yeah, I mean, I share your feeling 100%. It's so frustrating. I mean, to be fair, we have seen huge protests all over the U.S., unprecedented, on every major U.S. university campus, with brutal repression. Not only on college campuses, we've seen tons of protests in major cities. We saw this huge protest in Washington against Netanyahu's visit. So there is this rebellion. But again, the U.S. is not a democracy. I mean, the U.S. is a deeply authoritarian regime. And the political leadership is not democratic. It's not accountable. It's a plutocracy. Even mainstream scholars at universities like Princeton and Northwestern have published quantitative research showing how average people have no impact on government policy. Only big corporate interests and money have an influence. So the U.S. is not a democracy. The people have been rising up, but the question is, can we actually change the political system to make it actually accountable to the voice of the people? Because polls show the majority of people in the U.S. do not want to continue sending weapons to Israel. And even the irony is that within the Democratic Party, a majority of Democrats do not support sending weapons, and a majority say that this is genocide, including a majority of young people overall, regardless of party, say that it's genocide. And meanwhile, the Democratic president is, of course, backing this genocide. I mean, I agree 100% with you. I will add one other quick point, though. This is not on a pessimistic note, but we should be realistic. This is by no means the first time. This is exactly what the U.S. was doing in Vietnam. 3 million people were killed in Vietnam. Korea, 20% of the North Korean population was killed in the U.S. war on Korea in the 1950s. That's according to Curtis LeMay. It's according to U.S. government data. 20% of the population. That was a genocide. Of course, what the U.S. backed in Indonesia under Suharto. I mean, there's so many examples of this throughout history, and the U.S. government has continued doing it. So, I mean, we've always seen people rising up and protesting and rebelling. Again, it's not. I don't think the problem is necessarily the people. The problem is the political system, which fundamentally needs to change.
Yeah, exactly. And I think a lot of times that question can be leveled at, well, when are Russia, when are China, when are the bigger powers? Well, if you go back to the so-called Cold War, no matter how much support, let's say, the Soviet Union would give to, let's say, Communist Party in Indonesia, anywhere, like it can't necessarily stop. If the United States has the means, can't necessarily stop it without, as the Soviet Union was trying to avoid, for many decades, potential nuclear conflict, which we got quite close to during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, that's again, it always goes back to that for me. It's like when you have an aggressive, at this stage, this like imperialist unipolar power with the means to do this, and with, as you cited, Daniel Ellsberg, like with plans to do it, you do navigate more delicately, as whether we like it or not, right? whether we like it or not, that's kind of just the objective reality. But Got Milk, thank you so much for this. Free Palestine indeed. Thank you so much, wonderful Can. Thanks for that super sticker. Thank you, Von Hock Wong, for this super sticker. Thank you, Maxwell. Thank you, Sparky. Zehan constantly lies and fools people by speaking in a reasonable tone. I don't know how, but there's a lot of just YouTube is a very weird place. So I'm not surprised actually that his following.
This is actually a smart comment. This is something that I try to work on, because I get passionate and heated about these issues, and I get kind of angry sometimes. And I try to speak more calmly, because it's true that it can, if you don't agree with someone and they're kind of yelling, they can kind of push them away.
Right.
Whereas these propagandists like Peter Zeihan, because they talk very calmly, people think, oh, he's very logical. So I'm actually trying to be. I mean, it's good to have passion, but for a YouTube video, it's not that. I'll leave the passion for like a speech.
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough too. I mean, guys like Zehan, they get the privilege of the YouTube boosts of keywords, especially around China. Unless we're gonna, I feel like there's a whole cottage industry of people who make a lot of good business selecting certain topics about China, all these like lies, and people, it's just eaten up because of how much. There's just such an investment in it. But yes, also, whispering in the mountains, I guess, has a particular, especially with the people who really hate China, because we often think of people who really hate China as, they're like the MAGA, they're following Donald Trump. They're like, there's a lot of, I grew up in the 90s in a liberal city. Let's just say the people who are for Tibet, let's say separatism or they're not MAGA people. Of course, if you ask them MAGA, they might agree with it. But like the people really, they think that's a liberal cause. So, there's a wide attraction to this, I guess I'll just say. Sparky, thanks so much again. None of your business. Thank you so much for the super sticker. And Sparky, I won't shout you out again because you've got a lot of shout outs. All right, Ben. Everyone, follow Ben and Geopolitical Economy Report. You can find the YouTube channel below. Anything else you want to plug before we go?
No, just thanks for having me, Danny. Keep up the great work. I always love watching your videos. It's great to join them sometimes as well.
Yeah,
let's just keep it up and try to build more space in alternative media here, providing these perspectives to push back against the corporate media, which we all know is misinforming people.
Sure. Let's do it more. As much as we can, work around the 12-hour nightmare that is the time difference.
I'll be back in China in a few weeks, so it makes it very hard. It's easier in Latin America.
Maybe we will. Hopefully, we'll get to meet up. But let's leave it there, everyone. Everyone, like the video before you go. Go to the video description, find Lee Camp's work, find Ben Norton's work, and of course, all the places to support this channel: Patreon, Substack, PayPal, buy me a coffee, whatever you like. Become a YouTube member like some have here. Thank you, everyone who watched today. Peace out.